What would you do if you had just 1 second to choose between following protocol and saving a life? In the glittering world of royalty, where every gesture is calculated and every moment is scripted, sometimes the most heroic acts come from breaking all the rules. This is the extraordinary true story of how a single guard's lightning-fast instincts turned what should have been an elegant royal gathering into a heart-stopping moment that would change everything. Behind the palace walls, danger doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, disguised as something as innocent as a crystal glass catching the afternoon light. But when seconds matter and lives hang in the balance, heroes emerge from the most unexpected places. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about royal security, human intuition, and the split-second decisions that separate tragedy from triumph. This isn't just another royal story. It's a testament to the power of trusting your instincts when everything else tells you to stay silent. The question isn't whether you would have acted as quickly. The question is whether you would have seen the danger at all. The afternoon sun streamed through the massive crystal windows of Kensington Palace, casting dancing rainbows across the polished marble floors. Princess Catherine, known to her friends as Kate, stood gracefully in the center of the grand reception hall, her emerald green dress complementing the ornate decorations that surrounded her. The occasion was meant to be simple, a private gathering with distinguished guests from the Commonwealth nations, a routine diplomatic event that happened dozens of times each year. But there was nothing routine about the feeling that had been gnawing at Senior Protection Officer Marcus Thompson since he'd arrived that morning. A 20-year veteran of royal security, Marcus had developed what his colleagues called an uncanny sixth sense for danger. It wasn't something he could explain in his reports or justify to his supervisors, but it had kept him and his charges safe through countless potential threats over the years. As he stood positioned near the ornate fireplace, his trained eyes continuously swept the room, cataloging every face, every movement, every shadow. The guest list had been thoroughly vetted, backgrounds checked, and cross-referenced multiple times. Security sweeps had been conducted at dawn and again 2 hours before the event. Metal detectors, explosive detection systems, and chemical sensors had all given the all-clear signal. By every measurable standard, this was one of the safest environments in all of Britain. Yet Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The guests mingled politely, their conversations a gentle murmur of diplomatic pleasantries mixed with genuine admiration for the palace's historic architecture. Ambassador Chen from Singapore was engaged in animated discussion with the High Commissioner from New Zealand about trade relations. The Canadian delegate, Mrs. Morrison, was carefully examining a portrait of Queen Victoria while sharing stories of her own grandmother's memories of the coronation. Everything appeared exactly as it should be. Kate moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her warm smile genuine as she listened to each guest's stories and concerns. She had perfected the art of making each person feel as though they were the most important individual in the room, a skill that had endeared her to millions around the world. Today, she was discussing education initiatives with Dr. Patel from India when the refreshments were brought in on gleaming silver trays. The palace staff, dressed in their crisp uniforms, moved with choreographed precision. Each had been with the royal household for years, their loyalty and trustworthiness beyond question. James Whitmore, the head butler, personally oversaw the arrangement of delicate finger sandwiches, perfectly arranged canapes, and the finest bone china teacups that had served royalty for generations. But it was the crystal glasses that caught Marcus's attention. They were beautiful, hand-blown Waterford crystal that caught and refracted the afternoon light into thousands of tiny rainbows. Each glass was a work of art, worth more than most people's monthly salary. They had been specially selected for this event, part of a new set that had arrived just 3 days earlier as a gift from the Irish government to commemorate the strengthening ties between the two nations. Marcus had been present when they were unpacked, watching as the palace staff carefully removed each piece from its protective wrapping. He remembered thinking how unusually heavy they seemed, how the light seemed to bend differently through them compared to the palace's usual crystal. But these observations had been filed away as mere curiosity. After all, different craftsmen had different techniques, and Irish crystal was renowned for its unique properties. Now, as he watched Kate reach for one of the glasses from the tray being offered by a smiling staff member, that nagging feeling exploded into full alarm. There was something about the way the light was refracting through the crystal, The rainbows weren't quite right. The patterns were too regular, too geometric. In his years of security training, Marcus had learned to recognize the subtle signs of concealed weapons and hidden dangers. He'd studied how different materials interacted with light, how weight distribution could indicate hidden compartments, how even the most innocent objects could be turned into deadly weapons by those with sufficient skill and malicious intent. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt. The crystal wasn't pure. There were inclusions, deliberate inclusions that formed a pattern. And that pattern, when subjected to the right frequency of vibration, would cause the entire glass to shatter in a very specific way. Marcus's mind raced through the possibilities. Sound waves from the palace's heating system, the natural frequency of human speech, the barely perceptible vibrations from the traffic outside. Any number of environmental factors could serve as the trigger. But the most likely culprit would be the gentle tapping of silverware against the glass, a common occurrence at formal gatherings when someone wanted to make a toast or call for attention. The fragments wouldn't scatter randomly. They would be directed, weaponized, turned into projectiles that could cause devastating injuries to anyone within a 3-foot radius. And Kate was about to lift the glass to her lips. Every instinct screamed at Marcus to act, but his training also demanded absolute certainty before disrupting a royal event. False alarms could end careers, and the political implications of stopping a diplomatic gathering based on nothing more than a feeling could be enormous. He had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision that could either save a life or destroy his own. In those crucial moments, Marcus's training took over. He thought about every lesson learned in hostage situations, every split-second decision that had meant the difference between success and failure. He remembered the words of his first instructor. Trust your instincts, but verify with your eyes. When in doubt, err on the side of action rather than regret. His eyes focused intently on the glass in Kate's hand. She was raising it toward her lips, preparing to take a sip of the sparkling water that had been specially prepared for the royal palate. The other guests continued their conversations, unaware that anything might be amiss. The palace staff maintained their positions, ready to serve and assist as needed. But Marcus saw what others couldn't see. The microscopic stress patterns in the crystal. The way certain sections seemed to pulse slightly under the changing light conditions. The almost imperceptible movement of tiny particles suspended within what should have been perfectly clear crystal. His hand moved to his radio, but he realized there wasn't time to call for backup or explain the situation to his colleagues. Any delay might prove fatal. The glass was now mere inches from Kate's lips, and he could see her beginning to tilt it for that first, potentially deadly sip. The weight of responsibility settled on Marcus's shoulders like a lead blanket. 20 years of service, an impeccable record, the trust of the royal family, his own reputation and career, all of it could be destroyed in the next few seconds if he was wrong. But if he was right and did nothing, the consequences would be infinitely worse. The room seemed to slow to a crawl as Marcus made his decision. Every detail became crystal clear. The pattern of afternoon shadows on the wall, the gentle rustle of Kate's silk dress, the soft murmur of conversation, the delicate chime of silverware against china. In this frozen moment of perfect clarity, he understood that some decisions transcend personal consequences. Kate's lips were parting slightly, preparing for that first sip, when Marcus launched himself across the room with the explosive power of a trained athlete. His years of physical conditioning and combat training propelled him forward with surprising speed, his mind calculating angles and distances with mathematical precision. The guests were just beginning to notice his sudden movement when Marcus's hand connected with the crystal glass, sending it flying from Kate's grasp in a shower of sparkling fragments. The sound of shattering crystal echoed through the reception hall like a gunshot, instantly silencing every conversation and drawing every eye to the dramatic scene unfolding before them. Time seemed suspended as dozens of crystal shards caught the afternoon light, creating a brief moment of terrible beauty as they scattered across the marble floor. Kate stood frozen in shock, her hand still positioned where the glass had been just moments before. The other guests stepped back instinctively, their faces reflecting confusion, alarm, and growing concern. Marcus hit the floor hard, his momentum carrying him past Kate and into the ornate side table that held the flower arrangements. Antique vases toppled and crashed, adding to the chaos and destruction. Palace staff rushed forward from all directions, some moving to assist Marcus, others immediately forming a protective barrier around Kate. But even as he struggled to regain his footing, Marcus's eyes were fixed on the scattered crystal fragments. His training in explosive devices and chemical warfare had taught him to recognize certain telltale signs, and what he saw confirmed his worst fears. The broken glass revealed tiny chambers that had been expertly concealed within the crystal structure. These chambers contained a substance that was already beginning to react with the air, producing a faint, almost invisible vapor. The realization of what might have happened sent a chill through Marcus's entire body. If Kate had taken that sip, if the liquid had made contact with the substance hidden within the crystal, the chemical reaction could have been catastrophic. Burns to the mouth, throat, and digestive system. Potential poisoning. At minimum, serious injury that could have had lasting effects on her health and well-being. As security personnel flooded the room and began evacuating the guests, Marcus finally allowed himself a moment of relief. His instincts had been correct. His split-second decision had prevented a tragedy that could have had international implications. But even as the immediate crisis passed, he knew that this was just the beginning. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create this weapon, to smuggle it past multiple layers of security, to position it perfectly for maximum effect. The investigation that would follow would be extensive and far-reaching. Questions would be asked about how such a sophisticated weapon could have penetrated royal security. The guest list would be scrutinized again, this time with the knowledge that someone with access to the highest levels of government and diplomacy had been involved in this plot. But for now, as Kate was quickly escorted from the room by her security detail, and Marcus was surrounded by his colleagues demanding explanations, one thing was absolutely certain. A disaster of unimaginable proportions had been averted by the quick thinking and decisive action of a single guard who had chosen to trust his instincts over protocol. The crystal glass lay in pieces across the marble floor, its deadly secret finally revealed. The rainbow patterns that had once seemed so beautiful now told a much darker story, a story of hidden dangers, international intrigue, and the thin line that separates safety from catastrophe in the rarefied world of royal security. Within minutes of the crystal glass shattering across the marble floor, Kensington Palace transformed from a scene of diplomatic elegance into a fortress under siege. Red emergency lights flashed in corridors where tourists usually walked peacefully, and the sound of heavy boots echoed through halls that normally heard only whispered conversations and the soft rustle of ceremonial robes. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Reynolds arrived at the palace 17 minutes after the initial alert was broadcast across London's security network. A specialist in international terrorism and chemical weapons, Reynolds had been tracking sophisticated assassination attempts across Europe for the better part of a decade. But even her extensive experience hadn't prepared her for what she found in the reception hall of one of Britain's most secure locations. The scene had been carefully preserved by palace security, with every fragment of crystal photographed and catalogued before the specialized chemical analysis team could begin their work. Kate had been immediately taken to a secure medical facility where royal physicians could conduct comprehensive tests to ensure she hadn't been exposed to any harmful substances through skin contact or inhalation. The diplomatic guests had been questioned and released after their backgrounds were re-verified through international security databases. But it was Marcus Thompson who found himself at the center of an investigation that was growing more complex by the hour. Sitting in a windowless conference room deep within the palace's security wing, Marcus faced a panel of officials whose combined authority could reshape international relations with a single decision. Reynolds led the questioning, her sharp eyes studying every micro-expression as she worked to understand exactly what had transpired in those crucial seconds. "Officer Thompson," Reynolds began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with matters of national security, "I need you to walk me through your thought process one more time. Start from the moment you first noticed something unusual." Marcus had already told this story 6 times to different officials, but he understood the necessity of repetition in cases of this magnitude. Every detail could be crucial. Every observation might provide the key to unraveling a conspiracy that had clearly been months or even years in the planning. "It started when the crystal arrived 3 days ago," Marcus explained, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that was beginning to set in. "I was present during the unpacking process, as I always am when gifts arrive from foreign governments. Standard security protocol requires observation of all items that will come into contact with members of the royal family. Reynolds nodded, making notes on her tablet while maintaining eye contact. What specifically caught your attention during the unpacking? The weight distribution was unusual. Irish crystal is typically dense, but these pieces seem to have inconsistent density patterns. Some sections felt heavier than others, which shouldn't be possible with traditional glass-blowing techniques. Marcus paused, organizing his thoughts. I also noticed that the refractive properties were different from other crystal in the palace collection. The way light bent through the glass created patterns that seemed too regular to be natural. The revelation that the crystal had been examined upon arrival sent a ripple of concern through the investigative team. If the weapons had been detected during the initial security screening, why hadn't they been removed immediately? The answer, as Reynolds was beginning to understand, lay in the sophisticated nature of the threat itself. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the leading expert in chemical warfare detection who had been summoned from her laboratory at Cambridge University, entered the conference room carrying a sealed case containing samples from the shattered glass. Her preliminary analysis had revealed something that challenged everything the security team thought they knew about concealed weapons. The substance hidden within the crystal chambers is unlike anything we've encountered before, Dr. Hartwell announced, her academic composure unable to completely mask her excitement at the discovery. It appears to be a binary chemical agent that would only become dangerous when mixed with a specific catalyst. The catalyst, we believe, was contained in the liquid that would have been served in the glass. The implications of this revelation were staggering. Someone had created a weapon system so sophisticated that it required multiple components to be brought together in a precise sequence. The crystal itself was harmless. The liquid refreshment was equally innocuous. But when combined under the right conditions, they would create a reaction that could cause severe injury or death. Reynolds leaned forward, her investigative instincts fully engaged. Dr. Hartwell, how long would such a weapon take to develop and test? Based on the precision of the chemical engineering involved, I would estimate at least 18 months of development time. This wasn't the work of a lone individual or even a small group. The resources required suggest government-level backing or involvement by a major international criminal organization. As the scope of the conspiracy began to emerge, Marcus found himself thinking about the diplomatic implications of the attack. The crystal had been a gift from the Irish government, but that didn't necessarily mean Ireland was involved in the plot. More likely, the real perpetrators had chosen this method precisely because it would cast suspicion on an innocent nation and potentially damage relationships between longtime allies. The investigation expanded beyond the palace walls as international security agencies were contacted, and evidence was shared across secure networks. The Irish authorities were immediately cooperative, providing detailed documentation of the crystal's manufacture and transport. What they discovered painted a picture of meticulous planning and sophisticated infiltration. The crystal had indeed been manufactured in Ireland, but by a company that had recently been purchased by a consortium of international investors. These investors, when traced through layers of corporate structures and shell companies, led to a network of individuals with connections to several nations that had ongoing diplomatic tensions with Britain. Meanwhile, forensic accountants began examining financial records to trace the money trail that had made this elaborate plot possible. The amounts involved were substantial. Hundreds of thousands of pounds had been spent on research, development, and execution. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity, but a carefully orchestrated attempt at international destabilization. As the hours passed and more information emerged, Marcus began to understand the true magnitude of what his instincts had prevented. The attack hadn't just been aimed at Kate personally, though her injury or death would certainly have been the immediate objective. The real goal had been to create an international incident that could derail peace negotiations, destroy diplomatic relationships, and potentially justify military action. The timing of the attack supported this theory. The Commonwealth gathering wasn't just a routine diplomatic event. It was a preliminary meeting ahead of major trade negotiations that could reshape economic relationships across multiple continents. Kate's presence had been specifically requested by several nations as a symbol of Britain's commitment to maintaining strong historical ties while building new partnerships for the future. Her injury or death would have sent shockwaves through the international community. Questions would have been raised about Britain's ability to protect even its highest-profile citizens. The Irish crystal connection would have created suspicion and mistrust between nations that had worked for decades to build peaceful cooperation. The carefully planned trade negotiations would have collapsed, potentially costing both nations billions in lost economic opportunities. But there were even deeper implications that were only beginning to emerge. Intelligence analysts studying the evidence were discovering connections to other recent incidents across Europe. A poisoned diplomat in Prague, a mysterious explosion at a peace summit in Geneva, an outbreak of food poisoning at a United Nations gathering in Vienna. Incidents that had been treated as isolated events were now being re-examined as possible components of a coordinated campaign. Reynolds coordinated with her international counterparts as the investigation took on global dimensions. The sophistication of the chemical weapon suggested involvement by individuals with advanced scientific training and access to specialized equipment. The precision of the timing and placement indicated detailed intelligence about royal security procedures and diplomatic protocols. The psychological profile of the perpetrators was equally concerning. This wasn't the work of ideological extremists or mentally unstable individuals. These were professionals, possibly state actors, who had demonstrated patience, resources, and technical capability that posed a threat to international security at the highest levels. As night fell over London, emergency sessions were convened in government offices across multiple continents. The attempted assassination of a member of the British royal family was more than just a criminal act. It was an attack on the stability of international relations and the security of diplomatic processes that formed the foundation of peaceful coexistence between nations. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself grappling with the personal implications of his actions. He had saved Kate's life, prevented an international incident, and exposed a conspiracy that threatened global security. But he had also violated direct orders, destroyed valuable diplomatic gifts, and created a scene that would require careful management to prevent panic and maintain public confidence in royal security. The commendations and recognition would come later. For now, he was still being questioned, his actions analyzed and scrutinized by experts who needed to understand every detail of the event to prevent similar attacks in the future. His split-second decision was being examined from every possible angle: psychological, tactical, procedural, and strategic. But as Marcus sat in that windowless conference room, answering the same questions for the 7th time, he felt no regret about his actions. His training had taught him to trust his instincts, and his instincts had been proven correct in the most dramatic way possible. The crystal fragments spread across the marble floor had revealed their deadly secret, vindicating his decision to act decisively in the face of uncertainty. The investigation was far from over. The perpetrators remained at large, their identities hidden behind layers of false documentation and corporate structures. The full extent of their network was still unknown, and the possibility of additional planned attacks couldn't be ruled out. Security protocols would need to be revised, diplomatic procedures would require modification, and international cooperation would become even more crucial in the fight against sophisticated terrorist organizations. But the immediate crisis had been averted, and the foundation had been laid for a comprehensive response that would span continents and involve some of the world's most elite security professionals. The Guard's instant action had not only saved a life, it had preserved the delicate balance of international relations and protected the democratic processes that allowed nations to resolve their differences through dialogue rather than violence. The morning after the crystal incident brought a flurry of activity that extended far beyond the walls of Kensington Palace. In secure facilities across 3 continents, intelligence analysts worked around the clock to piece together a conspiracy that seemed to grow more complex with each passing hour. What had begun as a single act of potential violence against a member of the royal family was rapidly evolving into something that threatened the very foundations of international diplomacy. Kate herself had spent the night in a secure medical facility, undergoing comprehensive testing to ensure that no trace amounts of harmful substances had affected her health. The royal physicians, working in consultation with chemical warfare specialists, had found no evidence of exposure, but the psychological impact of nearly consuming a potentially deadly substance had been significant. Despite her characteristic composure in public, those closest to her could see the strain that the incident had placed on someone who had dedicated her life to service and had never imagined becoming the target of such sophisticated malice. Hartwell's analysis of the crystal fragments had revealed even more disturbing details overnight. The chemical compound hidden within the glass wasn't just designed to cause immediate harm. It was engineered to create symptoms that would mimic natural causes, making detection difficult and potentially allowing the perpetrators to escape suspicion. The delayed onset of effects would have made it nearly impossible to trace the source of any illness back to the crystal glass, creating the perfect cover for what amounted to state-sponsored assassination. The technological sophistication required for such a weapon had implications that extended far beyond this single incident. Intelligence services worldwide were now racing to determine whether similar devices had been deployed in other diplomatic settings. Every gift exchanged between nations in recent months was being re-examined, every formal gathering was being reviewed for potential security breaches, and every international agreement was being scrutinized for signs that negotiations might have been influenced by the threat of hidden violence. Marcus found himself at the center of a media storm that he was completely unprepared to handle. News of the incident had leaked despite official efforts to maintain secrecy, and journalists from around the world were seeking information about the guard whose quick thinking had prevented an international tragedy. The palace press office was working overtime to manage the narrative while protecting both Kate's privacy and the ongoing investigation, but the pressure for information was intense. The diplomatic implications were equally challenging to navigate. The Irish government, despite having no involvement in the conspiracy, faced difficult questions about how their diplomatic gift had been weaponized. Prime Minister O'Sullivan had personally called Downing Street to express his horror at the incident and pledge full cooperation with the investigation. The centuries-old relationship between Ireland and Britain, which had survived wars, political upheavals, and cultural differences, now faced a new test as both nations worked to ensure that this attack wouldn't damage their carefully rebuilt trust. Reynolds coordinated with international partners as the scope of the investigation continued to expand. Intelligence sharing agreements that had taken years to negotiate were being activated, bringing together experts from agencies that rarely collaborated on such a scale. The Mossad provided expertise in chemical weapons detection, the CIA shared intelligence on international terrorist financing, and European agencies contributed surveillance data that was helping to track the movements of suspected conspirators across multiple borders. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Margaret Chen, a material scientist at MIT who had been consulting on the analysis of the crystal structure, noticed something that had been overlooked in the initial examination. The glass contained trace elements that were characteristic of a very specific type of sand found in only a few locations worldwide. More importantly, the manufacturing process had left microscopic signatures that could be traced to individual equipment used in the glass blowing process. This discovery led investigators to a small specialized workshop in the Czech Republic that had been contracted to create experimental art pieces 6 months earlier. The workshop owner, initially cooperative, became evasive when questioned about the specific techniques used to create the hollow chambers within the crystal. It quickly became apparent that he had been approached by individuals claiming to be collectors of unique glassware, willing to pay premium prices for pieces that incorporated innovative internal structures. The trail led from Prague to Vienna, then to a network of shell companies registered in Luxembourg, Cyprus, and the Cayman Islands. Each layer of the conspiracy revealed more sophisticated planning and greater financial resources than investigators had initially estimated. The operation had required coordination across multiple countries, access to advanced chemical research, and infiltration of diplomatic channels at the highest levels. But perhaps most concerning was the discovery that this wasn't an isolated plot. As international agencies shared information, patterns began to emerge that suggested a coordinated campaign spanning several years. The attempted poisoning in Prague had involved similar chemical compounds. The Geneva explosion had been preceded by the delivery of diplomatic gifts that had never been properly examined. The Vienna incident had occurred at a gathering where several nations had exchanged ceremonial items as part of a cultural exchange program. The realization that multiple attacks had been attempted using similar methods sent shockwaves through diplomatic communities worldwide. Traditional security protocols, designed to detect conventional weapons and explosives, were inadequate against threats that could be disguised as legitimate diplomatic gifts or cultural artifacts. Entire procedures would need to be revised, testing equipment would require updating, and international agreements governing diplomatic exchanges would need comprehensive review. Marcus, meanwhile, was struggling with his newfound status as an international hero. The media attention was overwhelming for someone who had spent his career working in the shadows of royal protection. Interview requests came from news organizations in dozens of countries. Book publishers were offering substantial advances for his story, and security consulting firms were competing to recruit him with offers that dwarfed his government salary. But what troubled Marcus most deeply was the knowledge that his instincts, as accurate as they had proven to be, might not be sufficient to detect future attacks of this sophistication. The perpetrators had demonstrated capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about security and threat detection. If they could develop weapons this advanced once, they could certainly do so again, potentially with even greater sophistication and harder-to-detect methods. The psychological profiling of the conspiracy was equally disturbing. Intelligence analysts studying the evidence concluded that the perpetrators operated with the patience and resources of a state actor, but without the restraints that typically limited government-sponsored operations. They appeared willing to risk international incidents, diplomatic crises, and potential military responses in pursuit of their objectives. This combination of capability and recklessness represented a new category of threat that existing security frameworks weren't designed to address. As the investigation progressed, additional evidence emerged that painted an even more troubling picture. Financial records revealed that similar amounts had been spent on research and development projects in several countries over the past 3 years. Patent applications for innovative glass manufacturing techniques had been filed in multiple jurisdictions, suggesting ongoing development of even more sophisticated delivery methods for chemical weapons. The international response was swift and comprehensive. Emergency sessions of the United Nations Security Council addressed the threat posed by weaponized diplomatic gifts. NATO allies activated information-sharing protocols that had previously been reserved for major security crises. Even nations with traditionally difficult relationships found themselves cooperating in ways that would have been unimaginable just days earlier. Kate, despite the trauma of her experience, insisted on maintaining her public schedule to demonstrate that terrorist threats wouldn't disrupt the normal functioning of democratic institutions. Her first public appearance after the incident drew unprecedented security attention, but also generated overwhelming public support from citizens who recognized the courage required to continue her duties despite knowing that sophisticated enemies were targeting her personally. The security implications extended beyond royal protection to encompass diplomatic security for officials worldwide. If a member of the British royal family could be targeted so precisely within one of the most secure facilities in Europe, no diplomatic figure could consider themselves truly safe. Security budgets were increased, protection protocols were revised, and international cooperation on threat assessment reached levels that hadn't been seen since the immediate aftermath of major terrorist attacks. The investigation itself had become a model for international cooperation in the face of transnational threats. Agencies that had historically guarded their methods and sources jealously were now sharing information in real time, recognizing that the sophistication of modern threats required unprecedented levels of collaboration. The success in identifying and tracking this conspiracy was providing valuable lessons that would strengthen global security for years to come. But even as the immediate crisis was being addressed, troubling questions remained unanswered. The true identity of those behind the conspiracy was still unknown, hidden behind layers of false identities and corporate structures that spanned multiple continents. The extent of their capabilities remained unclear, and the possibility that additional attacks were already in preparation couldn't be ruled out. Most concerning of all was the realization that traditional concepts of national security and diplomatic immunity might no longer be adequate in an era when sophisticated weapons could be disguised as gifts between friendly nations. Marcus continued to be debriefed by teams of specialists who were studying every aspect of his decision-making process. Psychologists wanted to understand the intuitive processes that had allowed him to detect danger that sophisticated equipment had missed. Security experts were analyzing his training and experience to identify factors that could be incorporated into protection protocols for other officials. Military strategists were examining the tactical implications of his rapid response to determine whether similar techniques could be applied in other contexts. The Crystal incident had become much more than a single prevented assassination. It was serving as a catalyst for fundamental changes in how nations protected their leaders and conducted international relations in an age of sophisticated hidden threats. 6 months after the crystal glass incident, The world had changed in ways both visible and hidden. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but the far-reaching implications continued to reshape international relations, security protocols, and the very nature of diplomatic engagement between nations. The investigation had finally yielded results that validated the enormous resources devoted to unraveling the conspiracy. Through painstaking analysis of financial records, surveillance footage, and electronic communications intercepted across multiple continents, investigators had identified a network of operatives working for what appeared to be a rogue faction within a former intelligence service. The group, comprised of highly trained specialists who had been disavowed by their original organization, had been operating as mercenaries for hire, selling their sophisticated capabilities to the highest bidder. The client behind the assassination attempt remained officially unidentified, protected by layers of anonymity that even the world's most advanced intelligence agencies couldn't fully penetrate. But the evidence pointed to a consortium of interests that benefited from destabilizing international trade relationships and maintaining regional conflicts that might otherwise be resolved through diplomatic means. The attempted murder of Kate hadn't been personal. It had been a calculated business decision designed to prevent economic agreements that would reduce demand for certain types of military equipment and conflict resolution services. Marcus had found his life transformed in ways he could never have anticipated. The initial media attention had eventually subsided, but the respect he had earned within professional security circles had opened doors to opportunities that went far beyond his original career in royal protection. He had been recruited to lead a new international task force dedicated to detecting and preventing sophisticated assassination attempts against diplomatic figures worldwide. Based in Geneva and funded by a consortium of allied nations, the task force represented a new model of international cooperation in the face of transnational threats. The work was challenging and often dangerous, but Marcus found it deeply satisfying to know that his experience was helping to protect officials from dozens of countries. The psychological profiling techniques developed from his debriefing sessions were being taught to security personnel worldwide. The intuitive threat detection methods he had employed were being studied by researchers who hoped to develop technological systems that could replicate human instincts in identifying hidden dangers. Kate herself had emerged from the experience with a deeper appreciation for both the dedication of those who protected her and the sophisticated nature of modern threats. She had insisted on being briefed on the full extent of the conspiracy, despite concerns that the information might increase her anxiety about future public appearances. Instead, understanding the true nature of what she had faced seemed to strengthen her resolve to continue her public duties without allowing security concerns to limit her effectiveness. Her first major international trip after the incident had been carefully planned to demonstrate that terrorist threats wouldn't curtail her diplomatic activities. The visit to 3 African nations, accompanied by unprecedented security measures that remained largely invisible to the public, had been a resounding success. Local populations had responded enthusiastically to her presence, and the diplomatic objectives of strengthening Commonwealth relationships had been achieved despite the additional complexity of enhanced protection protocols. The Crystal incident had also sparked innovations in security technology that were benefiting far beyond royal protection services. New detection systems capable of identifying microscopic chemical traces in seemingly innocent objects were being deployed at airports, government buildings, and diplomatic facilities worldwide. International standards for examining diplomatic gifts had been completely revised, with new protocols requiring analysis by multiple independent laboratories before any item could be brought into contact with protected officials. Hartwell had found herself at the center of a new field of study that combined traditional chemistry with national security applications. Her analysis of the crystal weapon had led to breakthrough research in chemical detection that was saving lives in contexts ranging from food safety to industrial accident prevention. The techniques developed for identifying the binary chemical weapon were being adapted to detect everything from environmental contaminants to pharmaceutical counterfeiting. The diplomatic implications of the incident had been carefully managed to prevent the crisis from damaging relationships between innocent nations. Ireland and Britain had worked closely together throughout the investigation, and their cooperation had actually strengthened bonds between countries that had overcome centuries of conflict to build a peaceful partnership. The transparency with which both governments had handled the crisis had become a model for how nations could work together when faced with threats that transcended traditional boundaries. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact had been the recognition that traditional approaches to international security were inadequate for addressing modern threats. The crystal weapon had demonstrated that sophisticated adversaries could exploit the very symbols of peaceful cooperation: diplomatic gifts, cultural exchanges, ceremonial objects, to deliver violence that could destabilize entire regions. Reynolds, now heading an expanded international investigation unit, had overseen the development of new protocols for information sharing that were preventing similar attacks before they could be implemented. The network of former intelligence operatives responsible for the Crystal incident had been systematically dismantled, with arrests made in 7 countries and assets frozen in dozens of financial institutions worldwide. The legal proceedings that followed had established important precedents for prosecuting transnational terrorism cases. For the first time, individuals could be held accountable for conspiracy charges that spanned multiple jurisdictions, with evidence gathered through international cooperation being accepted in courts that had previously been limited to considering only domestic intelligence. The successful prosecution had demonstrated that even the most sophisticated criminal networks could be brought to justice when nations were willing to work together effectively. The rogue intelligence network had been more extensive than initially realized, with connections to several other high-profile incidents that had previously been attributed to different causes. The bombing of a trade summit in Southeast Asia, the mysterious illness that had affected delegates at a peace conference in South America, and the explosion at a cultural festival in Northern Europe had all been linked to the same group through forensic evidence and financial connections discovered during the Crystal investigation. The scope of their operations had been truly international, with cells operating on every continent and capabilities that rivaled those of major government intelligence services. The fact that such a network could operate undetected for so long had forced intelligence agencies worldwide to reconsider their assumptions about non-state threats and the resources that criminal organizations could bring to bear against legitimate governments. Marcus often reflected on how a single moment of intuition had unraveled a conspiracy that had taken years to construct and had threatened the stability of international relations at the highest levels. The decision to trust his instincts over protocol had not only saved Kate's life but had exposed a threat that might otherwise have continued to operate in the shadows, potentially causing far greater damage over time. The personal cost had been significant. His previous life of relative anonymity was gone forever, replaced by a public profile that brought both opportunities and risks. Death threats from supporters of the dismantled network were a constant concern, requiring him to live with security measures that would have seemed excessive just months earlier. But the knowledge that his actions had contributed to a safer world for diplomatic officials everywhere provided compensation that no amount of money could match. The technological innovations sparked by the investigation continued to yield benefits across multiple fields. The chemical detection methods developed for analyzing the crystal weapon were being adapted for medical diagnostics, environmental monitoring, and industrial quality control. The collaboration between security agencies and academic researchers had created new models for applying scientific research to practical security challenges. Educational institutions worldwide had incorporated the Crystal incident into their curricula as a case study in international cooperation, threat assessment, and crisis management. Students of international relations, security studies, and diplomatic history were analyzing the event from multiple perspectives, generating insights that would inform policy decisions for decades to come. The incident had also prompted soul-searching within the intelligence community about the ethics of sophisticated surveillance and the potential for former operatives to use their training for criminal purposes. New oversight mechanisms had been implemented to track former intelligence personnel, and international agreements had been strengthened to prevent the proliferation of advanced surveillance and assassination techniques to unauthorized actors. Kate continued in her public duties with the knowledge that she was protected by security measures that had been fundamentally transformed by the lessons learned from her near-death experience. The protocols developed for her protection were being adapted to safeguard officials worldwide, creating a legacy of improved security that would benefit countless individuals who would never know how close they had come to facing similar threats. The crystal fragments that had once threatened her life were now preserved in a secure facility, where researchers continued to study them, developing new understanding of how everyday objects could be weaponized by sophisticated adversaries. The beautiful rainbow patterns that had once seemed so innocent served as a permanent reminder of how appearances could deceive, and how vigilance remained essential even in the most seemingly secure environments. As the first anniversary of the incident approached, Marcus was invited to address an international conference on diplomatic security. Standing before an audience of security professionals from more than 50 nations, he spoke about the importance of trusting trained instincts while maintaining rigorous analytical standards. His message was simple but profound. In a world where threats could hide behind the most innocent facades, the combination of human intuition and technological capability provided the best defense against those who would use violence to achieve their goals. The crystal incident had begun as a single moment of potential tragedy, but had evolved into a catalyst for positive change that would protect innocent lives for generations to come. The guard who had acted on instinct in a split second had helped create a safer world for everyone who worked to build peace and understanding between nations.